In this video, we'll be exploring unsolved mysteries that range from the strange, sudden, very sudden disappearance of a young man from Minnesota to a series of bodies and body parts found inside suitcases in England to one of the darkest, most suspicious kidnappings of a young girl in Rome, involving the Vatican, involving high-up state service in the Vatican and Italy, and involving Americans, conspiracies, corruption, backhanders, and much more. We will explore all of these, so grab a drink. My choice today is just plain English tea in a really nice Disney mug, and join me as we explore the Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg, the 1465 mystery eruption. So this is a very long tale, and I will leave a link in the description below if you want to learn about the full story of it. But this was basically an eruption that we know very likely happened in the 15th century, as it was witnessed basically all around the world, from like Turkey to Europe to Asia, and it also coincided with a bunch of cold spells, you know, mini ice ages all around the world, famines, floods, crop failures, as I said, from Asia to Europe to even South and Central America. And so the evidence for this was all pointing to this gigantic volcanic explosion or volcanic eruption, possibly the largest ever in recorded history. But when scientists went to track this volcano, you know, to maybe find a site, the origin of this eruption, they did say it likely came from somewhere in the tropics. But aside from that, they had no major crater, no exact location for it, no mountain or volcano that they think it might have come from. And so we have this huge volcanic event that we don't really know where it came from. And the exact date of this eruption was kind of vague in the past, like they went off estimates, until in 2012 scientists got these really accurate ice cores. And ice cores are fantastic because each layer of the ice core normally, not always, normally comes with like a dark section and a light section, with each dark section typically being like a wintry or cold period, and the lighter sections being more or less summer. And they're also able to detect other things in the ice, you know, different chemical compositions, etc. And so with a good enough ice core, they're able to kind of track the years all the way back, find when it was hot, when it was cold, different temperatures thousands of years ago. And for something like a volcanic explosion, which obviously shoots a lot of chemicals and debris and material up into the sky, which then eventually lands back down, goes onto ice, goes into the ice cores, they were able to determine that this was very likely caused by two medium-sized explosions and not one absolutely humongous explosion. But that still didn't solve our problem of not knowing where they came from. So even to this day, we know there were very likely two medium-sized explosions or eruptions around this area, but we don't have a pinpoint location for them. We don't know if they were land eruptions or underwater eruptions or eruptions from islands that have since sunk. And yeah, a great mystery, and as I said, check out the link in the description if you'd like to learn a little bit more about these eruptions. The 1808 mystery eruption. And I promise this is not a volcanic eruption iceberg. I swear this is the last one. But this entry is more or less the same as the last entry. You know, it's based around this mini ice age that happened in the 1800s, with 1816 being called the year without a summer, just because of how relatively cold it actually was, mostly in Europe. And as with the other one, the ice core data shows like massive spikes of sulfates, which are normally caused in volcanic eruptions, sometime around and before like the 1810s, but we have no official record of an eruption happening around then. So it's strange. Something clearly caused temperatures to drop all over the world. Something produced these sulfates found in the ice core, but there are no records that we found, at least so far, pointing to an actual gigantic volcanic eruption. Scientists do believe that this could be explained by like multiple medium-sized explosions all around the world. You know, instead of one giant one going off, maybe you have like 15 medium-sized ones. But that is, for now, the end of the volcanic eruption entries. The 1894 Rock Island Railroad wreck. And that is a tongue twister if I've ever seen one. But this was the largest unsolved crime in history in the city of Lincoln in Nebraska. But this was a shocking crash where this train was carrying 33 passengers and was traveling from Fairbury to Lincoln, both in Nebraska. And while just in the final few minutes of its journey, it was going over this trestle. The trestle started to kind of creak and bend a little bit, and then started to suspiciously crack and twist, and then taking on the full weight of the train, the trestle actually gave way, and both the trestle and the train collapsed and fell down into the creek below. And since this was a coal train, the engine then exploded into flames, with flaming hot coals spreading and spilling out on the wooden trestles, on the wooden tracks, and soon enough, the entire crash, the tracks, the train, all of the luggage, and even the people went up in flames. Some of the men on board, one of whom actually had a broken leg from the crash, first climbed out to safety and then actually climbed back into the train, back onto the wreckage to help rescue the other people. And they did manage to save quite a few people, with 22 out of the 33 passengers actually surviving. But sadly, 11 of the passengers, many of whom were in the front carriage that, initially went down, sadly, 11 of them didn't survive the crash. And it was obviously a horrific scene. They saved who they could save, and then police started an investigation into this. And what they found was potentially some evidence of foul play in this accident, or, in this accident, where some spikes that were holding the trestle together, they had been pulled out, removed. There were crowbar marks also found on the rails, and upon further searching of, the surrounding area, they found an abandoned crowbar that it could be argued was used on the tracks. And they found at the scene of the crime a man named George Washington Davis, who witnesses and survivors of the crash said that they saw Davis kind of around there. They said he was acting a little bit suspicious. He was holding a lantern at the time. And so the investigators obviously brought him in, they questioned him, and he said he was there at the scene because he had basically heard about the crash, and then he had run 4 miles, so like an hour of running roughly. He had run 4 miles from the club that he was in to the scene of the crime because he said he wanted to witness it, which, if you ask me, is a little bit strange. There was also some parts of his testimony that didn't really line up. Like, for example, he said he came here, he was looking at the crash, and it wasn't that bad until the engine exploded, and then obviously it got a lot worse. Except investigators at the time determined that the engine likely exploded very soon after the train crashed. And so, we're talking minutes after it crashed, not the hour or more that it took for Davis to get here. So mostly because of this, he was there, he was acting a little bit suspicious, his timeline didn't really, line up. Mostly because of this, they arrested him, they tried him for this crime. It was for sabotage and murder, essentially. But bear in mind, most of this was just circumstantial evidence. They never determined a motive for Davis, and he never admitted to the crime. He always protested his innocence. But as I said, during the first trial, he was charged with sabotage and first-degree murder, but this ended up being a hung trial, so no verdict. Then on the second trial, the judge told the jury that if you don't find him guilty of first-degree murder, then you could always just find him guilty of second-degree murder, which on this second trial, the jury did, and Davis was charged with this. He was sent to prison, but was paroled 10 years later due mostly to the lack of evidence surrounding his case. So as I said, a lot of the evidence surrounding Davis's conviction was just circumstantial, and either it was some crazy accident, which doesn't seem likely just based on the evidence, or it was someone else entirely, in which case we don't know who they are, we don't know their motive, or it was actually Davis, and in this case also we don't really know his motive. So not too much clarification on this one. That is where the case remains to this day, but regardless, this crash was absolutely horrific. Anne Noblette was a 17-year-old girl who went missing while on her way home in 1957 and was found a month later in these very strange circumstances. So Anne was a student at the Watford Technical College in Hertfordshire, England, and on this particular day she was attending a dance, and she had a fun evening. She said goodbye to her friends, left the dance, and then took the 391 bus heading home. But she never made it. She was soon reported missing by her parents. The police started a local search. They started conducting interviews. They searched nearby areas and buildings. They used sniffer dogs. But ultimately, outside of a single potential sighting of the headlights of a car being seen on the same road that Anne went missing, around about the same time, outside of this single sighting, there really wasn't much to go on. That is until around a month later, when two brothers were out just walking their dog at the time, and they found Anne's body dumped just 7 miles from where she went missing. She had been seemingly kidnapped, assaulted, strangled to death, and then strangely frozen solid, as when her body was found, she was completely frozen. But the temperatures, the outside temperatures around this time, weren't nearly low enough for this to have occurred naturally. So appropriately, this case was dubbed the deep freeze murder. And as I mentioned before, she was very likely stripped down, assaulted, and then killed. But when she was found, she had all of her clothes on her, but her buttons were done up a bit strangely. Her sleeves were pulled up in a way that she normally didn't have it. So whoever did this likely assaulted her, killed her, and undressed her in some order, and then froze her somewhere and redressed her and then dumped her out for someone to find. So police started searching local refrigeration units, local freezer units, local buildings and warehouses, farms, factories, abandoned buildings, but they didn't really find anything of interest. And since there was no DNA evidence for this crime, there was nothing when she went missing, there was nothing on Anne or at the scene of the body, we still don't know who committed this horrible attack, and Anne's case, sadly to this day, remains unsolved. The arboreal abomination. Is this thing an alien, some say, or a demon, or some other type of entity, seen in Peru in 1965? The men who saw this abomination described it as a strange Martian, resembling a shrub, which I would say is quite accurate. And shortly after this sighting, there was a flying saucer seen by these men, as well as a few other witnesses around this area around this time. So I think definitely alien. This abomination had a single golden eye on its head and had these golden, silvery, tinsely strips kind of surrounding it all around its body, and it had other golden eyes around its body, and I think what they saw was a Christmas tree, gold and silver tinsel all around its body, very bush or tree-like. Multiple golden silver eyes, or baubles, you could say, around its body, and a single golden eye on top of its head. I mean, granted, it was only 31 inches tall, and it was the middle of summer, but maybe it was an alien cosplaying as a Christmas tree, appearing as something familiar to us, but they don't know that a Christmas tree is inappropriate in the middle of summer. So definitely a strange sighting, but let me know your thoughts on this one down below. Athalia Lindsley. Was this lady a former model, dancer, TV personality, even game show host, who was brutally murdered outside of her home in St. Augustine, Florida in 1974? And she had bounced around a few things over the years, seemed to be quite successful overall, and had even dated JFK's older brother in the 1940s, but eventually she would marry a man named James Lindsley. And so at the time, in 1974, she was happily married, but for whatever reason, they chose to live in 2 separate homes, which is fair enough. You need your own personal space, Totally get that. But fast forward to this fateful night, and one of Athalia's neighbors, a young man named Locke McCormick, he heard some fighting, some struggling outside on the street. He took a look out of the window, and then he shouted to his mum that Mr. Stanford is hitting Miss Ponsell. Mr. Stanford being one of their neighbors, who we will touch on in a little bit. But this man, whoever it was, this attacker, he finishes attacking Athalia, he then runs away. Locke and his mum come outside, and they see Athalia in a pool of her own blood. So they call the police, the ambulance, etc. But sadly, Athalia is pronounced dead at the scene. She was attacked with a machete. She was hit at least 9 times, all on her hands and her arms, her face, her head, and during this attack, she was almost decapitated. Now, Mr. Stanford, the man that Locke said he originally saw, he already had a record, a history of not liking Athalia, of having a problem with her personally, of having a problem with her dogs, and on at least one occasion of threatening to attack and even kill her. So with good reason, I think, he was picked up by the police, and with Locke's eyewitness, he was charged for this crime. But he ended up pleading innocent. There wasn't really much evidence for this crime outside pretty much Locke's eyewitness testimony. But, you know, it was dark. He kind of only caught a glimpse of this man. So it might have been Mr. Stanford. It might have been just another, you know, male figure. And so all of this led to Mr. Stanford basically being acquitted. The jury took a mere 2 hours to decide on this, and they decided, you know, that there wasn't enough evidence to convict Mr. Stanford. And so, with their main suspect being let free, and with no other suspects, the police really had no more leads to go on. And on top of this case, strangely, tragically, that very same year, Athalia's friend and neighbor, Francis Bemis, who may have had some top secret evidence in Athalia's murder. You know, she was potentially writing a book about Athalia's murder, investigating the case, building up evidence, and then she went out for a walk one evening and just never came home. Her body was found nearby in a abandoned lot, with her head having been smashed in, and her case as well as Athalia's case were both never solved. So was France's murder connected to Athalia's? Was someone potentially trying to cover up Athalia's murder? You know, cover up the evidence that Francis had gathered? I'd say it's very possible, if not likely, but as I said, to this day, both cases still remain unsolved. Bear dogs, which, yep, that's an actual thing. But these are animals that you can obviously guess are kind of part bear, part dog, and they're not strictly like an actual crossbreed of the two, but they're basically as big and aggressive as bears while also looking like dogs. And these aren't actually cryptids, or I guess technically they might strictly be, but they are an actual animal family called the Amphicyonidae, who lived from about 2 million to 40 million years ago. And basically just imagine something like a cross between a grizzly bear and a direwolf, and you are most of the way there. But even though they are thought to be extinct, there have been sightings of them all around the world, from like remote parts of North America, Alaska in particular, in Europe, also in Asia, and especially Russia. And as I said, they are these huge bear-like creatures with scary canine-like features, and one major area for these sightings is the Nahanni Valley in Alaska, also known as the Valley of the Headless Men, named so because of the sheer number of decapitated prospectors and visitors found there, which is a little disconcerting, but a lot of people believe these beheadings, believe these attacks to be perpetrated by these bear dogs, you know, living and lurking deep in the wilderness, in Alaska, in the forest, in the woods, which firstly, isn't as crazy as it sounds, because there are huge parts of Alaska and especially of Russia, you know, in the Urals in particular, that are either somewhat, mostly, or entirely unexplored. Tundras, forests, woods, mountains, vast plains, absolutely huge areas. So a once thought extinct species living out there, attacking people, roaming around, honestly, really isn't as crazy as it seems. We know at least that they did exist at some point in time, as there are many fossil records of them. They are in the timeline of, you know, creatures, animals on Earth. But this mystery, this entry, is really about the modern day sightings of them. They likely weigh anywhere from like 1,500 to 2,000 pounds, or 650 to 900 kilos. And are these sightings merely just, you know, hoaxes? Are they misidentifications perhaps of, you know, regular bears, of wolves? Or are these sightings indeed of the dreaded old bear dogs, just out, chilling, hiding, minding their own business, until someone encounters them and then they take a little chomp out of them, maybe behead them entirely? I will leave that up for you to decide. The Burkshere UFO Incident is one of the most well-documented UFO sightings in American history, and it took place on the night of September 1st in 1969 in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. Oh boy, I haven't said this in a while. Massachusetts. And this wasn't just a single sighting, but it involved multiple unrelated witnesses spread across different towns and different areas, all of whom described more or less the same thing, and that was bright lights, strange crafts, missing time, and even alleged abductions. It all started out at around sunset on this September evening, when dozens of residents from several towns in Berkshire County all started reporting this strange disc-like object in the sky. It was large, it was glowing, it seemed to move like kind of erratically around, and it was completely silent with no seemingly obvious propulsion system. People said that it went from like hovering to just making these crazy, impossible maneuvers, and then it just zipped off into the unknown. Some of the witnesses disappeared for minutes or hours and then reappeared in places that they didn't know how they got there. Some of them didn't know where they were, what time it was. They were disorientated, and one guy was apparently hit with a beam of light while he was at a friend's house and then vanished for several minutes and then reappeared in the middle of the road, not knowing how he got there, what time it was, where he was, and said he had been taken by UFOs. Another family, the Reed family, were all in their car. They saw these lights in the sky. The lights kind of engulfed their entire car. They felt a pressure or gravity change, and then they all blacked out and woke up a while later, not in their car, but somewhere else entirely. And I think the very odd thing about these encounters is that none of the people really knew each other. You know, they weren't from one community or one family or one friends group. They were all different ages, races, from different towns, different social circles, and they all described on the same night this same craft, the same lights, the same experiences, and a few of them described these abductions. And on that particular night, the local radio stations were just going crazy with callers. The police reports were piling up for these strange sightings, these strange occurrences, but still to this day, nobody's entirely sure what this encounter was. Some people theorize it was a strange alien craft. Some people say it was a secret military experiment or craft. And yeah, for sure, let me know your thoughts on this one down below. And if you do like alien encounters, I have a 8-hour long alien encounter video that covers hundreds of entries of alien encounters, potential alien species, and sightings and theories that I will leave in the description below if you want to go check it out. The Birmingham Booms are these low-frequency boom sounds heard over Alabama, especially in Birmingham and Anniston, over the last 20 years or so. And there are a wide range of potential explanations for this, but none of them really stand up to like any scrutiny, any investigations. Like some people say they're just fireworks, but these booms tend to be, you know, too loud, too powerful to be fireworks. Could they be quarry blasting? Well, they checked the records and none were apparently scheduled for the times that these booms happened. Some people have said it was thunder, but there was no thunderstorms or bad weather at that time, or at these times, as it's happened multiple times. And it's the same with sonic booms from airplanes, with earthquake explanations. Like, a lot of them partially explain the booms, but also don't fully explain them or don't fully line up in the timeline. Some people think they're underground gas explosions. Some people think they're aliens or secret military experiments, or time jumps, time slips, you know, people from the future or aliens zipping in and out of different dimensions. And I think these explanations get crazier and crazier as we go on. But to this day, we don't fully know what causes them, and they are a little bit strange. Bobo is a very short entry, but Bobo is just a cryptid. It's this aquatic creature that resides mostly in the North Pacific Ocean, potentially near the Monterey Bay in California, and it honestly looks kind of like a Leopleurodon. Charlie, it's a Leopleurodon, a magical Leopleurodon, glap glap. Glap, glap. But it is about the size of a whale, it has wrinkly skin, and that is Boba. Brandon Swanson was a 19-year-old student from Minnesota who in 2008, on the night of May 14th, was driving home from a college party, and at around 1:30 in the morning his car slid off the road. It went into a ditch near the town of Lind, and he wasn't hurt, at least not too badly. You know, maybe a few minor bruises, but he was basically fine. The car wasn't really damaged majorly, and so he did what any normal person might do. He pulled out his phone and he called his parents to come pick him up. And this is where things start to get weird. Brandon told his parents that he thought he was near the town of Lind, and so he would make his way, he would walk down to these lights that he saw in the distance, so that he wasn't just in the middle of nowhere, in a ditch, in the pitch black, in the middle of the night. So he started making his way towards the lights. He was on the phone the entire time with his parents, talking for like 47 minutes about, you know, oh, I'm going this way, I'm walking down the road, I'm annoyed that the car crashed into the side. It was all really standard, really normal conversation. Then he mentioned that he was passing some fences, and then said he was gonna cut through this field, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he shouted, "Oh shit," and then the phone line went dead. That was the last time anyone heard from or saw Brandon Swanson. There were no screams, no struggle, just him shouting once and then silence. Police later discovered that Brandon wasn't near Lind at all. His car was actually found in this ditch 25 miles away from Lind, near a town called Taunton. So either his GPS was off for some reason, somehow, or he had massively mistaken where he was, where he ended up, where he was going, etc. And obviously, naturally, a search was started. They searched over the local area for weeks. They found nothing. They had sniffer dogs who did pick up Brandon's scent, and they tracked it heading towards a river, and then turning back, and then just nothing. They used dogs, as I mentioned, but also helicopters, boats. They used sonar. The National Guard even joined in, but they never found anything. They never found Brandon Swanson or his body. They never found his phone, his clothes, his wallet, no shoes, no further trace or trail. It was literally like he just vanished into thin air. Some people say that he slipped, he fell into this river, and then just got washed away and disappeared. But you'd think something would turn up. You know, normally when this happens, the body ends up getting spotted further down the river, or, you know, his belongings end up getting found or spotted somehow. Other theories say that he was maybe attacked and abducted by someone, but again, there were no signs of a struggle, there were no witnesses, he was on the phone during the entire time, and there was never any other voices heard or any talking that wasn't Brandon. Some say that he intentionally did this to maybe disappear or run away from home, which I think is very unlikely. Other theories say that he had some sort of a mental episode and ended up running away, or at least becoming lost and disorientated. And of course, there are a few more fringe theories like, you know, alien abduction, or something like the back rooms where he just fell into another dimension. But regardless, to this day, Brandon Swanson's case remains open, it remains unsolved, and we don't really know what happened to him on that fateful night, or in fact whether he or his body will ever turn up. The Brighton Trunk murders. So these were these two murders that took place in the 1930s in Brighton, and this was on the 17th of June in 1934, when one William Joseph Vinicombe noticed a piece of luggage or a trunk left abandoned at the Brighton train station. So he went up to investigate it, thought somebody might have, you know, left it behind or lost it, until he noticed the horrific smell coming from this trunk, and so decided to call the police. The police arrived on the scene, they searched the trunk, and what they found was absolutely disturbing. They found inside the trunk just the torso of a dead woman. No head, no limbs, just the torso neatly packed into the trunk and left there inside the station. They then obviously started an official investigation. They searched the surrounding area and they wanted to know where this trunk came from, whether it was brought here on another train, so they started to call other train stations. And it was then that they found another trunk, another suitcase, this time at the King's Cross rail station in London, and this one contained the legs of whoever this lady was. The head and the arms of this body were never found. The lady was never identified, but through a post-mortem they determined her to be around 25 years old at the time of death, and sadly, horrifically, around 5 months pregnant. Then, while searching areas nearby this first trunk in Brighton, they heard reports of an awful smell coming from a flat, an apartment near the Brighton station. And when they searched this flat, they found a trunk, and inside the trunk was another body of another lady, this being Violet K. And her partner, Tony Mancini, was nowhere to be found. Now, Tony himself was a bit of a wrong'un, you know, a bit of a dodgy guy. He did typically petty crimes like theft, jaywalking, loitering, and murder, apparently, which, disclaimer, murder is not a petty crime. But he had been dating Violet, who was an ex-dancer, an ex-adult worker, for at least a year by this point. And one night, Violet was at the cafe where Mancini worked, and she was drunk. They were having like a verbal fight. She was accusing him of basically cheating on her with one of the waitresses. And then, after this night, Violet was never seen alive again. She initially went missing. Her sister-in-law received a telegram, later found to be in Mancini's handwriting, basically saying that I, Violet, have found an amazing job out in Paris, and I'll be sailing out there this Sunday, and, you know, goodbye. Mancini told all of his friends basically the same story, that Violet had found a job and just decided to leave him, to flee the country. And due to obviously finding Violet's body in Mancini's apartment, and with Mancini being missing, they naturally put out a warrant for his arrest. They ended up finding and picking him up shortly after in London, and brought him in, interviewed him, and ultimately charged him for Violet's murder. And just as a bit of extra detail for this, when Mancini killed Violet, he basically put her in this trunk, he moved houses, he moved locations, and he kept this trunk at the end of his bed. He put like a tablecloth over the top of it and actually used it as more or less a coffee table to have cups of tea on and plates with food, with some visitors and friends of his actually noticing this strange smell, and he every time just, I guess, brushed it off, said it's just the pipes or something, even as blood and other liquids and stuff started to actually leak from the trunk, which is just beyond disturbing. As I said, he was charged with Violet's murder. The trial lasted 5 days, and after just 2 hours and 15 minutes, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty. What? Now, the first case involving the lady with her body parts split up into different cases, or into different trunks, that case was never solved, and police didn't think that that case was connected to the Mancini case. They just happened to both be in Brighton around the station, 2 separate women dead in 2 separate trunks, but they never suspected him of this first case, but they obviously did suspect him of the Violet murder. And I think the evidence is all, clear as day, but due to, I guess, a great defense by his lawyers and a somewhat shoddy prosecution, he got a verdict, as I said, of not guilty. His defense said that he basically found the body, he found Violet dead, and then didn't think anyone would believe him, so he panicked, he hid the body, and then ended up running away, which seems like absolute BS to me. But yeah, he wasn't convicted for this at the time, or actually ever, but later on in his life, he did allegedly confess to this crime, saying that basically Violet had come at him, she was drunk, she attacked him with a hammer, and then in the ensuing fight, she ended up dying, and then he, hid the body, didn't think anyone would believe him, and that was that. So this second case is technically unsolved, although we more or less know what happened with it. But the first case, where this unidentified woman was split into 2 trunks, police never found her head, never found her arms, and never identified her or the killer, and so that case remains almost completely unsolved. Bryce Laspiser was another strange case similar to the Brandon Swanson case that involved the mysterious disappearance of a teenage boy, and this was 19-year-old Bryce Laspiser, who was driving from his college in Northern California to his parents' home just 7 hours south. But during this time, his friends, his family noticed something was kind of off with Bryce. On his journey down, he stopped the car multiple times, he made these strange phone calls, he seemed increasingly paranoid, and just for the timeline, he started his journey to his parents' place just before midnight on August 28th. Then at around 1 a.m, so a few hours later, he called his mum and spoke to her for a while, but I guess didn't say that he was already on the journey because she thought that he was calling from his apartment. And so it's thought that that night he slept somewhere, maybe a hotel or a motel, maybe in his car or by the side of the road. Then the next morning, his mum and dad were notified that he had basically requested roadside assistance, and this was around 11 a.m. the next morning, but they told the parents that he had basically said he was stranded out on the road and he required a delivery of fuel, which, bear in mind, this was only a 7 or 8 hour drive, and so he should have easily been home by now if he was driving straight down. Obviously, if he stopped the car to sleep, that would have been different. But the roadside assistance guy, a man named Christian, he said that he had gone out, he had delivered fuel to, this kid Bryce at around 9 a.m. that morning. And the mum asked Christian if he could go out there again, see perhaps if Bryce was still there, if he needed help, and to tell Bryce to call his mum. And Christian did this. He found that Bryce was basically in the same spot that he left him. He was still moving, he was still talking, all that, but he just hadn't driven really from where he was a few hours ago. So Christian said, look, Bryce, contact your mum. Your parents are very worried about you. Give them a call. And he said that he was only 3 hours north of his parents. So 3 hours left on the drive, and this was around afternoon time. And then he said goodbye to Christian. He drove off, and that was around 3 p.m. Then his parents waited more and more time. They waited hours, and eventually Bryce hadn't turned up. He wasn't answering his phone, and so the parents filed a missing persons report. The police were actually able to track Bryce's phone, and they themselves went out there to visit Bryce and found that again he hadn't really moved much from where Christian had left him. You know, he drove maybe 15 minutes down the road out of sight, but then again had stopped the car. The police basically told him the same story that Christian did. You know, your parents are worried about them, answer their phone calls, give them a call, update them on what you're doing. And the police said that they didn't really notice anything too off about him. You know, he wasn't drunk, he didn't seem to be under the influence of anything, and he seemed to be, you know, somewhat coherent, somewhat reasonable, normal. And he called his parents again, said that he would make his way down until around 2 a.m. that night. He called his mum again and said that he was very tired and he didn't think it made sense to be driving at night. You know, it was very dangerous for him. And so his mum agreed that he should just pull over to the side of the road, sleep there, and come over the next morning. And bear in mind, this was around 27 hours after he initially left for what should have been a 7-hour journey. And so the night passed, and finally, eventually, the parents received a knock on the door at around 8 a.m. the next morning, and who they thought was Bryce knocking on the door, finally arriving, was actually a highway patrol officer who said that they had found Bryce's car abandoned at the bottom of a creek, flipped upside down, with the back window having been kicked from the inside out. They found Bryce's wallet, Bryce's ID, his laptop, his phone, everything, but no Bryce. Despite exhaustive searches with helicopters, dogs, divers in the nearby lake, they found no clues, no hints, no trails, and some people think that he suffered some sort of a psychotic break, as he did have somewhat of a history of mental health issues, and so maybe he just kind of flipped, didn't know where he was, ran away, either got lost or killed somehow, or this was just an attempt to run away, to change his name, become a new person, live a new life. But as I said, with no body, with no real evidence, no witnesses, and no trail and sightings of Bryce, we don't really know what happened to him, and it's seeming less and less likely as the years go by that we will ever solve this case. The Colonial Parkway killer was a killer involved in a series of murders from between 1986 to 1989. 4 double homicides at least that occurred along Virginia's Colonial Parkway, which is this quiet, kind of scenic, wooded area. All the victims were either young individuals or young couples, murdered in or nearby their cars, and because it was such a quiet, peaceful area, firstly, that meant that there were little to no witnesses, so great for committing these sorts of crimes. And secondly, this route tended to be quite a popular area for like a lover's lane, you know, with young couples driving up there, reenacting the car scene from Titanic. But a lot of these victims were strangled, a lot were shot. In several cases, the bodies seemed to be staged or partially undressed, and there were at least 3 couples listed as official murders in this case, with another couple technically being listed as like missing persons because their bodies weren't officially found. But as well as these 4 official cases, as I said, there were many potential other cases and connections, individuals or couples that have gone missing around this area over the years, and no one was ever arrested for these crimes. It's thought very likely that not all of the murders were connected, but whether that means we're looking at just 2 killers, or 4, or 6, or 10, or more, it's not entirely clear. Some believe that this was the work of a rogue law enforcement officer, as several of these victims seem to have pulled over voluntarily. Their windows were, you know, cranked down, so they seem to maybe have trusted whoever had stopped them. There's also common theories about this being the work of a serial killer, using this secluded area to do all of their deeds. And in 2024, just last year, police did actually announce that at least 2 of these victims were linked via DNA to a man named Alan Wilmer Sr., who was a local fisherman that had died in 2017. And it's kind of mixed news, I guess, because sadly these people that he killed won't ever receive justice. Alan was never actually punished for these crimes. He never ended up doing any prison time for them. But maybe it's a blessing in that was 7 years that he wasn't out, killing more people before the police made their discovery. But as for the rest of them, as I said, no one was ever arrested for any of the murders. There are a few minor suspects, a few kind of small pieces of evidence, but most of these cases still to this day, sadly, remain unsolved. The devil fungus of South California is a little strange. Like, literally, this story was from an anonymous woman who wrote into the Strange magazine to warn fellow readers of this strange fungus that she encountered in Southern California. She said that she was moving down to Palm Springs, and she mentioned this for some reason to her UPS driver. And the UPS driver was like, nah, trust, don't go down there. There's mad stuff in the desert, like flying cockroaches, mushrooms that grow on your skin, just all types of crazy stuff. And she was like, well, that's great telling me now. I've already sold my house. I've already bought a house in Palm Springs. And so she kind of paid him no mind. She obviously moved down there. And I won't go into all of the details of this story as it is quite long. I'll leave a link below if you want to check it out in full for yourself, as there isn't mushroom left in this video. But she said that while she was down there, she basically picked up a book on mushrooms, and it described naturally a bunch of different species of mushroom, a bunch of different types, with one mushroom, this specific mushroom, being the stalked puffball, which only grew in the middle of the desert in the middle of summer, that was known to attack living tissue. And since it only grew in the middle of the desert, in the middle, the peak, the hottest point of summer, hardly anyone actually encountered it until they did. So this same lady from the story, she was apparently out gardening one day, and she was, chopping this, planting that, and she saw on the ground, it's a cute little puffball mushroom. And then she was like, wait a minute, I remember reading about this. And as she was looking down at it, it just exploded. And all of these black spores went all over her skin. And she did initially wash it off, but apparently these black spores went deeper into her skin. They kept sprouting up like mushrooms or fungal areas. They were attacking her tissue, and the only way she was able to keep this attack at bay was by constantly taking this antifungal medicine. Now, it is kind of a wild tale. Was she telling the truth about this? The local news stations apparently didn't think so, as she said they didn't want to hear from her. They didn't want to, air any of her stories. And the mushroom societies that she wrote to never wrote her back. So to her, this was like this giant conspiracy, orchestrated by Big Mushroom, wanting to keep the public away from the information, the knowledge of this particular mushroom. And so she said that writing into Strange magazine was basically the only people that would actually post her story, and it was the only way that she could get her message out to as many people as possible. And it's definitely an entertaining story, definitely unusual, but believable, realistic, true. I will leave that up for you to decide. The Disc of Sabu is a phenomenal, strange artifact that I really should have included in the Ancient Artifacts Iceberg, which I might actually still do because I haven't released the last part of it, which stay tuned for that, and the episodes are linked below if you want to check them out. But this disc was discovered in 1936 when British archaeologist Walter Emery uncovered it in the tomb of Prince Sabu in Egypt. And we won't get too much into Prince Sabu. He was a fairly uneventful, a fairly unknown prince. He never got too into politics. He never took his father's throne, but he did get a royal royal burial, and this tomb is what was discovered by Emery. And in the tomb was this disc, and it was a stone disc about 2 feet wide with these 3 kind of radiating spiral blades coming out of a hole in the center, which is a rather odd piece. The disc itself was made from something called schist, which was a popular rock at the time. This was around 5,000 years ago, for carving certain statues, for carving figurines, but due to just the nature of the rock, it tended to kind of split more often than it should, or kind of chip or flake a little more easily, especially when using stone and copper tools, which firstly begs the question, how did they carve this stone so intricately? I mean, just look at it. And secondly, what the heck was it used for? And there are a few major theories for this, one being that it was just simply decorative. It was a cool spirally looking rock like modern art from 2,000 years ago, or it was some sort of mechanical object, maybe used in an actual ancient machine, or just for irrigation purposes to pump water back and forth for crops, etc. Or, and this is quite an interesting theory, or it was simply a copy of a metal disc that the Egyptians found, either as part of an alien craft, or while the Egyptians themselves were doing archaeological digs, and they found it buried below Egypt from an ancient civilization, a relatively advanced one that existed long before Egypt. So the theory goes that there was this metal version of this disc found, and since they didn't have the metal smelting and molding capabilities at the time, they simply recreated this metal disc out of stone, and then the metal disc got, lost to time. We no longer have it, but we do still have this stone replica, which I think, if nothing else, is a very fun theory. To this day, we still don't know what its purpose was, why it was made, or how they made something so intricate, but it currently resides in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo if you're ever there and you feel like checking it out. Discagma is a very interesting part of biological fossil history, which I guess it wouldn't be history that far back, but this was discovered in 2013 in South Africa, and Discagma are these little dudes, these little fossils of a genus of life that existed on land far earlier than we previously thought. And they aren't obviously animals, plants, fungi, but are basically thought to be early ancestors of these other forms of life. And the previous accepted knowledge was that at the time, like the pre-Cambrian sort of era, that the oceans of the world, they all had life. They had microbes and algae sort of thing, but that the land at the time was a complete barren landscape. It was just rocks and lava and pretty much nothing else. But it seems that according to these fossils, this life did exist at the time on land around this time, roughly 2200 million years ago, and it did over time slowly evolve into the life that we've all come to know and love. Very cool. The Dodder Rhino is this bronze lifelike life-size statue of a rhino named Woody that somehow found itself installed in the Dodder River in Dublin, seemingly overnight, and no one knows who did it, how they did it, why, or even exactly when, as it was seemingly just kind of there one day in the middle of the river, bolted down onto this plinth. And as I said, to this day it remains a mystery, but I think it is a truly fantastic and wonderful one. Eliminative materialism is a bit of a doozy. So we won't spend too long on this one because your head and mine might actually explode. But materialism is the philosophy or belief that that which is matter is all that exists. So fear, for example, love, pain. Materialism argues that these things don't exist in like the, spiritual or ethereal way that fear might exist, but actually that they can be explained very easily by, physical states of our brain, of actual matter, electrical signals, neural connections, which I would say isn't too unreasonable. But someone who is eliminative basically believes that X thing doesn't really exist at all. So for example, modern day physicists are eliminative of the 5 elements, which was this ancient Greek philosophical idea where all matter, all existence was basically made up of these 5 elements, which we now know them to be made up of, atoms and particles, etc. Modern day chemists are eliminative about miasma, which was an ancient concept where bad or foul smelling air was thought to basically cause diseases, and we now know that to be caused by, bacteria. So an eliminative materialist believes not that emotions are simply different forms or different causes of matter, but that these emotions don't even exist. Partly because they're so ill-defined. Like, how do you define materially when someone is fearful or when they're angry or in love, etc.? There's not like a switch or a checkbox inside the brain that goes like, tick, yep, fear. It's a whole complex array of different signals and different brain states that we just describe as fear or love or loneliness, etc. But this philosophy says that they are so ill-defined that anything outside of just the physical, makeup, physical order of the brain with the signals and anything that's matter, anything outside of that doesn't even exist. And as with all of these complex entries, I'm not entirely sure if I've explained it well enough, but either way, Emmanuela Orlandi. Oh boy, this is a very, very deep case. It involves conspiracies and cover-ups and high-up officials. It's spread across Vatican City and Italy and Rome with mob bosses, mob members, Americans, and a hell of a lot more. But we'll start with the timeline of events and then move into some of the theories, some of the conspiracies behind this. What happened, who was involved, how far up these conspiracies go. But to start with, Emmanuela Orlandi was a 15-year-old girl and she was a resident of the Vatican City, which is the world's smallest country, located within Italy, but more specifically located within Rome. And bear in mind, only about 500 people live in Vatican City. It's very, very small, and Emmanuela and her family were some of the few people who lived there because her dad worked in the Vatican itself. So she was well known within the Vatican circles. It's not too hard to know of everyone in a population this small. And she and her siblings were, as I said, all known. They would play in the Vatican gardens often, which were these private gardens closed off to the public. And she was, on this day, June 22nd, in 1983, she was attending a flute lesson in Rome. And this was not really too far at all from Vatican City, just really a short bus journey away. So she made her way over from Vatican City over to the music school, and she had her class and then called her sister and said that before the class, someone had come up to her claiming to be a representative of Avon products who sold, makeup, perfume, skincare, etc. And she said they basically offered her a decent amount of money to go to a fashion show nearby and to basically hand out flyers for 2 hours. Her sister said that maybe sounds a bit dodgy because it was a fairly simple job, but they were offering her a suspiciously high wage just for these 2 hours. So she said, probably don't take the job, just come back home sort of thing. And Emmanuela also told of this job offer to some of her classmates, and after the class finished, she walked with her classmates to the bus stop that she would normally take home. And this bus stop was the last place that Emmanuela was ever seen. She was seen a little bit later on at this same bus stop, but this time in the company of another girl who has actually never come forward and was never identified. But after the class, more and more time ended up passing, and Emmanuela never returned to the Vatican, she never returned home, and she never contacted anyone, never called anyone. So towards the evening, her parents started to get worried. Her family went searching around the Vatican. They went out to Rome to where she was last seen. They were asking the music school if they'd seen her. They were asking friends if they'd heard from her, but she seemed to be completely missing. The next morning, after there was still no sign of her, the police started a missing persons case, and soon a search and investigation was started. And this is where things start to get very dark, but also very weird and very suspicious. So in the first few days of this investigation, a man by the name of Giulio Gangi, who was a Secret Service agent in Rome and was also a friend of the Orlandi family, he was out investigating the disappearance, and he interviewed two police officers who were in the nearby area at the time of Emmanuela's disappearance. They both said that they saw Emmanuela in the company of a man holding an Avon Products cosmetic bag, and said that this man was driving a dark green BMW. So Giulio then managed to actually track down this car, which at the time was being repaired by a mechanic because one of its windows was smashed from the inside out. So clearly someone, very likely in my opinion Emmanuela, had actually tried to break their way out of this car. Giulio then tracked down the ownership of this car and found that it belonged to this woman, which he was then ready to investigate further before he was removed from the case and ordered to stop investigating by some of his higher-ups. Likely, I think, because he was learning a little bit too much about this case. Then the family started to receive these strange phone calls, which at the time were taken at face value, but only later on started to seem suspicious, which I will explain when we come to it. But basically, these were phone calls from people saying that they had seen someone that matched Emmanuela's description. You know, they matched her height, her hair color and length. They said she had a flute with her, and she was selling Avon products, and she had claimed to be a runaway named Barbara, who had apparently run away from home for a bit of freedom or whatever, but was going to return home later that year for her sister's wedding, which all seemed to line up because Emmanuela's sister was actually due to get married later that year. So as I said, if you take this all at face value, it seems that okay, yes, Emmanuela did run away. She was making a bit of money, perhaps selling Avon products, and she had changed her name. She wanted some freedom. She didn't want to be captured or returned home. And to add to that, none of these specific details were actually made available to the public at the time. So it seemed that these callers weren't hoaxes, that they were genuinely telling the truth, or that they were somehow inside calls. You know, maybe they were hoaxes, but they weren't perpetrated by the public. They were perpetrated either by the Vatican or by the police or Secret Service force. And they had inside knowledge of details of Emmanuela and were using this inside knowledge to cover up the fact perhaps that Emmanuela was taken. And they were trying to paint the image that Emmanuela had just simply run away. There's nothing to see here, and trying to muddy the investigation. Then we have these phone calls made to the family, to the investigators of the case, by someone dubbed the American because he had an American accent. And this American claimed to be part of an organization and said that his organization had kidnapped Emmanuela, and that these previous phone calls that had witnessed this girl called Barbara, you know, a young runaway selling Avon products, that these were actually lies perpetrated by his organization. He said that they had kidnapped Emmanuela and said that they would only release her in exchange for the release of a man named Mehmet Ali Agca, who was a man arrested and charged with the crime of shooting the Pope in 1981. So at this point, I honestly don't know what to believe or how far this conspiracy and case even goes. A few days later, one of Emmanuela's schoolmates received a call from a Middle Eastern man, and he said once again that he had Emmanuela and wanted to set up a direct phone line with the Secretary of State of the Vatican City, which they did. They set up a direct line and had as many as 16 calls between the Secretary of State and between the American, kind of talking about the abduction, talking about the case, trying to sort something out. And every time they traced the calls that the American made, they were found to have been made from public phone boxes and never from the same public phone twice. The American was never caught, never found, and the plot only gets deeper from here. The kidnappers said they would then leave proof that they still had Emmanuela in the form of a cassette tape, which was supposed to be a recording of a girl being tortured, and this tape was apparently left for the police. It was found, but the police said that they didn't believe that this voice was actually Emmanuela. Now, some of the family, especially her brother, did believe that it was her, and the original agent who found this cassette tape, he said that the one that the police released wasn't the same one as the one that I found. He said the one that he found was longer, it included some male voices in the background, and that it was just overall different. And actually, the original transcript of the tape taken by the police was longer and did include male voices, but the one released to the family and on official records seems to have been cut, manipulated, potentially faked for whatever reason. The American also stated that they were in possession of another missing girl and later said that they had killed her, but then kind of refused to show proof, or said they would show proof but never actually followed through with it. And during this entire investigation, the church, the Vatican, was supportive of the family. They were supportive of the investigation. They said, yes, we absolutely must find who did this. We must return Emmanuela home. But according to the family, Pope John Paul II, who was the Pope before Francis, he did visit the family. He did say we must do everything to bring Emmanuela home, but then after he left, he basically forgot about it. And I don't mean he, forgot, but he didn't visit the family anymore. He didn't make any more public mentions of Emmanuela, at least not in any meaningful way. And years later, the public prosecutor of Rome dismissed this Emmanuela case due to apparently a lack of new evidence, and stated that the theory of Emmanuela being kidnapped by this organization was simply a misdirection, a red herring, which is a very interesting point to make in an official statement. Then in 2013, when Pope Francis was, elected Pope, he went out to meet the Orlandi family and said to them that Emmanuela was in heaven, which according to the family they said was admittance by the church, by the Vatican, that they knew what had happened to Emmanuela, that she was at some point killed, even after explicitly stating for many years that they didn't know what happened to her. And the family tried to, arrange more meetings with the Pope or with the Vatican, but they said the Vatican never responded. It's an absolutely insane case if you want to read more about it. I'd recommend a documentary or two if you're interested, as it is really that big, that long and deep of a case. There were a bunch of theories about the ultimate fate of Emmanuela. Some say she's still alive and she's living in like a quiet commune somewhere in Europe, and there's different levels of belief about how much the Vatican knew, how much they were involved in this case. There are also some connections to the Italian mob and mafia, to bribery of certain Vatican officials, and despite all of these theories, despite all of these connections, sadly, Emmanuela was never found, her fate was never determined, nobody was ever charged for anything surrounding this case, and sadly, it was never solved. But wherever Emmanuela is today, I hope truly, genuinely, that she is in a better place. The Evansdale murders was the case of these two young girls, 10-year-old Lyric Cook Morrissey and 8-year-old Elizabeth Collins, who went missing whilst out for a bike ride in 2012. The two kids were dropped off at their grandmother's house in Black Hawk County in Iowa, and since it was a lovely summer's day, they decided to head out on their bikes, and they were both seen by witnesses kind of cycling around the local areas, around these trails, around this nearby Lake Myers. And this area was quite popular, especially on a lovely summer's day for people to go hiking, fishing, boating, or just walking, relaxing. But eventually, later on in the day, when these girls didn't return home, their grandma started to get worried. She informed their parents, and then they informed the police, and a local search was started. And they called friends, family, neighbors. They spoke with locals asking if they'd seen the girls anywhere. But since their last sighting several hours ago, these two girls just seemed to have vanished. Soon, a proper investigation and search was started. Hundreds of locals helped with, doing regular searches, with handing out flyers, with going around asking people if they'd seen the girls anywhere. And they searched nearby lakes, forests, trails, also, abandoned buildings, etc. And the FBI even got involved, with them using divers to search the local lake. But even after all of this, nothing really turned up. Until later that year in December, these hunters who were out, in the area, they discovered these two bodies, these two child-sized bodies, and they reported them, they called them in, and they were confirmed to be the bodies of Lyric and Elizabeth. They were left there, dumped 25 miles away from where they were last seen, and that's kind of as far as the investigation went. There were no witnesses of these kidnappings. There was no real DNA evidence at all. There were no prime suspects, no other clues. And so some of the only theories were that perhaps this was just a random serial killer or something who maybe saw the girls out here alone and it was a crime of opportunity, or that this was some way connected to Lyric's father, Dan Morrissey, who at the time of her disappearance was actually serving a 30-year sentence, as he had a history of substance use, of dealing, etc. And so one theory says that someone was trying to get revenge on Dan, or he owed someone a lot of money, so whoever did this was planning to kidnap Lyric and maybe to ransom her back to her father, but then for whatever reason that ended up falling through. We don't really know. As I said, there's not too much evidence for this one. There's no real suspects or motives outside of just pure guesswork, and sadly the murders of these two children and this case were never solved. Fast Blue Optical Transient is, in short, just a really, really bright light out in space, and we basically just don't really know what causes them. They're similar in ways to supernovae bursts, but not exactly, as you can see in this lovely image. And yeah, there's not really too much to go off for this one, but they are just one of the many, many space mysteries out there that we have yet to, at least for now, figure out. The Frankfurt Slasher was the name of this killer involved in as many as 9 murders in Frankfurt, Philly between 1985 and 1990. They were mostly adult workers, as is normally the case, and they were mostly found with their throats having been slit or slashed, and having been assaulted, stabbed, and even posed on several occasions, seemingly for whoever would find them. And as far as suspects went, there was only really one major suspect, and that was a man named Leonard Christopher, who was investigated when the 8th woman, Carol Dowd, was killed. And as Christopher worked nearby, he was, a little bit suspicious, so police started to investigate him. They seemed to like him for this murder, and even though there wasn't too much evidence against him, and a lot of the evidence was circumstantial, and he also didn't really match the description that someone gave of the person that Carol was last seen with, even still, he was arrested, he was charged with Carol's murder, and he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. But all the while, he constantly protested his innocence, even while he was on his deathbed in prison. And another lady named Michelle Denner was actually killed after Carol, while Leonard was in jail. Michelle's death seemed to be in much the same manner, much the same style as the other women, but the police at the time said they didn't believe her killing was connected to the other women, but that Leonard had killed the first 8 women, and Michelle's killing was just a copycat. And that is where the case remains today. 8 unsolved murders, 1 technically solved murder, 1 suspect who was convicted of 1 of the murders, who died in prison while protesting his innocence. So either they got the wrong man altogether, or it was some combination of they did get the right man, but perhaps there were multiple killers involved, and whether Michelle's killing was part of the same string of murders, or whether it was indeed just a copycat killer, we still to this day don't really know. And that is all we have time for. I am slowly chipping away at this Unsolved Mysteries iceberg, and honestly, with every episode I make, I'm reminded of how just absurdly large it is. But we'll soon be making our way through Tier 9 in its entirety. So until then, remember to look after yourselves, stay hydrated, get some sunlight if you can. I will see you all in the next video, and as always, thanks for watching.